Boston Harbor sits empty. Ships that once loaded and unloaded goods from across the Atlantic ride at anchor with nothing to carry. The docks that fed a city built on trade stand quiet. Warehouses hold cargo that cannot legally move. Fishermen who depend on the harbor for their livelihood watch water they cannot use for the one purpose that makes it valuable to them. An entire city's economy has been stopped by a piece of paper written 3,000 miles away. Not by a blockade, not by a siege in any military sense, by an act of Parliament, the Boston Port Act, one clause in a legislative package designed with a specific calculation behind it. Punish Boston severely enough and precisely enough that the other 12 colonies watch quietly, protect their own trade, and let Massachusetts absorb the consequences alone. That calculation was not stupid. It was a bet, a strategy that had worked in comparable situations before, built on a reasonable assumption about how self-interested colonies with no history of acting together would behave when only one of them was being punished. How does a law built specifically to isolate one city end up uniting 13 against the government that wrote it? Here is how it started. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of Boston colonists boarded 3 ships in the harbor and dumped roughly 90,000 pounds of East India Company tea into the water, a direct response to the Tea Act, which had granted the company a near monopoly on colonial tea sales and, more fundamentally, to years of accumulated grievance over taxation imposed by a parliament in which the colonies had no seated representation. Word reached London by January. The reaction in Parliament was not measured deliberation. It was punishment, and it was framed that way openly. A demonstration, aimed as much at the other 12 colonies as at Massachusetts itself, of exactly what defiance of Parliament's authority would cost. The specific strategic logic behind the response deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as simple overreaction. Isolate the offending colony. Apply severe, targeted consequence. Let commercial self-interest do the rest of the work. Because the other colonies, watching Massachusetts absorb real economic pain, would calculate that their own trade mattered more than solidarity with a city that had, after all, made this mess for itself by destroying private property. This strategy had precedent. Colonial administrations across the empire had used isolation and punishment to manage unrest before, and the underlying assumption that colonies with no direct stake in another colony's punishment would stay out of it reflected a century and a half of colonial behavior that had, more often than not, borne that assumption out. It had worked before, and yet this time it would not. Parliament did not pass a single punitive law in response to the Tea Party. It passed several, collectively known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, and the specific architecture of that package is where the miscalculation actually took shape. The Boston Port Act closed the harbor to nearly all trade until the East India Company was fully compensated for the destroyed tea. This was severe, and it was calculated precisely. Economic strangulation aimed at a single city, designed to be painful enough to force compliance without requiring Parliament to justify anything beyond straightforward restitution for destroyed property. On its own, this act might plausibly have stayed contained exactly where London intended it to stay, a Boston problem, watched by other colonies with sympathy but no direct reason to intervene. The Massachusetts Government Act went somewhere else entirely. This second act effectively revoked Massachusetts's colonial charter. The council, previously elected, became a body appointed directly by the Crown. Town meetings, the basic unit of local self-government across New England, the mechanism by which ordinary colonists debated and decided matters affecting their own communities, were sharply restricted, requiring royal governor approval to convene at all beyond a single annual session. Here is the specific mechanism worth sitting with because it explains everything that follows. A closed port punishes an economy. A revoked charter threatens a principle. Merchants in Philadelphia, planters in Virginia, and farmers in South Carolina had no direct financial stake in Boston's harbor traffic. They had every stake, structurally, in whether a colonial charter, the foundational legal document establishing how a colony governed itself, could be unilaterally stripped by Parliament whenever a colony's conduct displeased London. If Massachusetts's charter could be revoked by legislative fiat, no colonial charter was actually secure. The precedent was not about tea. It was about whether self-government in any colony existed at Parliament's permanent discretion or as something closer to an established right. Parliament had built the very thing it was trying to prevent, one clause at a time.
General Thomas Gage arrived in Boston in May of 1774, already holding one title, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in North America, and carrying a new one that made his position considerably more complicated, Royal Governor of Massachusetts, appointed specifically to enforce the coercive acts on the ground. Gage was not new to the colonies. He had served in North America for years, understood the political temperature reasonably well by the standards of British officers stationed there, and was, by most accounts, not a man inclined toward unnecessary provocation. His task, as defined by London, was straightforward in the abstract: implement the Massachusetts Government Act, enforce the port closure, and demonstrate that defiance carried real, sustained consequence. The task on the ground was almost nothing like straightforward. Gage was attempting to govern a colony whose population no longer recognized the legal authority under which he had been appointed to govern it. The council he was meant to oversee had, in the eyes of most Massachusetts colonists, been converted from a legitimate representative body into an instrument of a parliament that had just demonstrated it would rewrite the colony's founding legal terms whenever convenient. Town meetings, the institution through which Massachusetts communities had governed local affairs for generations, were now legally restricted, and colonists convened them anyway, in open defiance of the restriction, correctly calculating that Gage lacked the practical capacity to prevent thousands of small, dispersed local gatherings across the colony. He had troops. He did not have enough troops to enforce a law against an entire population's daily civic behavior, and every attempt to do so risked producing exactly the kind of incident: soldiers against civilians, in a colony already primed to interpret every such incident in the worst possible light, that London wanted to avoid. Gage found himself in the position of a professional soldier, ordered to make people obey a piece of political theory through presence alone, in a city where his presence was increasingly read not as governance, but as occupation. He wrote to London describing the situation with more caution than the ministry wanted to hear. The acts were not producing quiet submission. They were producing something else, and it was moving faster than anyone in London had allowed for. The mechanism that carried news of the coercive acts outward from Massachusetts faster than Parliament had accounted for already existed before the acts were passed. The Committees of Correspondence, an intercolonial communication network that had been developing since the early 1770s, organized initially around sharing information about British policy and colonial grievances between towns and colonies that had no formal political connection to one another, became, in the months after May 1774, the connective tissue through which the crisis in Boston reached every other colony in something close to real time. Samuel Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence functioned as the organizing engine at the center of this network, drafting and circulating detailed accounts of what the Massachusetts Government Act actually did, not filtered through London's framing of restitution and order, but described in the specific terms of a charter revoked and self-government suspended. Other colonies received this information and did something Parliament's strategy had not seriously accounted for as a serious possibility. They sent aid. Documented shipments moved toward Boston from colonies with no direct commercial stake in the harbor closure, and in several cases, genuine commercial reasons to prefer staying uninvolved. Rice moved north from South Carolina. Grain moved from other colonies along comparable routes. This was not universal or instantaneous. Colonial responses varied in speed and enthusiasm,
and not every colony moved with equal urgency. But the pattern was unmistakable, and it was the opposite of the pattern London's isolation strategy required. Colonies that had spent a century and a half with no meaningful history of coordinated political action were beginning to act, however unevenly, as though Boston's specific punishment was a shared problem rather than a contained one. If you're the kind of person who finds it satisfying watching a plan fail for exactly the reason its architects were most confident about, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part most textbooks compress into a single sentence. By late summer of 1774, the evidence had become difficult for anyone paying attention in London or in the colonies to interpret any other way. This was not going to plan. Stop here, because the aid shipments and the alarmed correspondence only tell you that colonies reacted. They do not yet explain why colonies with genuinely little in common with Massachusetts, different economies, different religious cultures, different relationships with Britain, colonies that had spent decades competing rather than cooperating with one another, experienced this specific act as a direct threat to themselves. The port closure was Boston's problem. Every colony understood that distinction clearly, and it is exactly why the Port Act alone likely would not have produced this reaction. The Massachusetts Government Act was different in kind, not degree, and the psychological mechanism is precise. Every colony in British North America governed itself, in practice, through some version of the same institutional architecture Massachusetts was having stripped away. A charter defining the colony's basic legal relationship with the Crown, and local governing bodies, whether town meetings in New England or county courts and assemblies elsewhere, through which colonists managed their own affairs with a degree of practical autonomy that a century and a half of distance and neglect from London had allowed to become customary, even where it was never formally guaranteed as permanent.
Parliament's action against Massachusetts established, as a matter of demonstrated fact rather than theoretical possibility, that this entire architecture existed at Parliament's discretion, not as an inherited right, not as a settled arrangement, as a temporary convenience that could be revoked by legislative vote whenever a colony's conduct became sufficiently inconvenient to London. A Virginia planter with no interest in Boston's tea or its harbor had every interest in whether his own colony's House of Burgesses could be dissolved and reconstituted as a Crown-appointed body the next time Virginia's conduct displeased Parliament. A Pennsylvania merchant, with every commercial incentive to stay uninvolved in Massachusetts's punishment, had direct personal stake in whether Pennsylvania's own charter carried any more permanence than the one Massachusetts had just lost. This is the specific miscalculation buried inside the coercive acts. Parliament had aimed a punishment at one colony's conduct, and in doing so, had demonstrated a capability against every colony's foundational legal existence. The other 12 colonies were not choosing solidarity with Massachusetts out of sentiment. They were recognizing, correctly, that Massachusetts's charter and their own charters rested on exactly the same unstable ground. On September 5, 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Georgia did not send delegates to this first gathering, held back by its own specific local concerns, including a reliance on British military support against nearby indigenous nations that made open defiance a genuinely different calculation for Georgia than for its neighbors. This was the first time in roughly 150 years of colonial history that representatives from across British North America had assembled to act as something resembling a single political body, not organized against France, not organized in a colonial war against a native nation, but organized in direct, deliberate response to their own government's exercise of authority over them. It was not instant agreement, and presenting it that way would flatten something genuinely important about how this Congress actually functioned. Real factional division existed inside Carpenter's Hall from the opening sessions. More conservative delegates, including figures like Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, pushed for a path toward reconciliation with Britain. proposals for restructured colonial representation within the existing imperial framework, an attempt to address the underlying grievances without severing the relationship.
More radical voices, concentrated heavily among the Massachusetts and Virginia delegations, pushed for firmer, more confrontational resistance, viewing anything short of direct economic and political retaliation as insufficient given what had just happened to Massachusetts's charter. These were not minor procedural disagreements. Galloway's plan of union, a genuine proposal for a reformed colonial legislature operating alongside Parliament, was debated seriously and rejected by a narrow margin, close enough that a different alignment of a handful of delegates could plausibly have produced a very different Congress and a very different subsequent decade. The unity that eventually emerged from Philadelphia was real, but it was contested, negotiated, and far from automatic.
Delegates who had never sat in the same room, representing colonies with genuinely conflicting economic interests and no shared history of political cooperation, spent weeks arguing their way toward a position none of them would have predicted possible a year earlier. What they eventually agreed on would give the Coercive Act's original strategic goal its most complete and specific reversal yet. The First Continental Congress produced two documents that mattered more than any speech given inside Carpenter's Hall. The Declaration and Resolves laid out the colony's position formally, asserting the rights they claimed under the British Constitution and colonial charters, cataloging the specific grievances the Coercive Acts represented, and stating plainly that Parliament's actions against Massachusetts's self-government constituted a threat the delegates understood as directed at all of them, not at Massachusetts alone. The Continental Association was the mechanism that turned that shared position into coordinated action. It was a colony-wide boycott, agreed to collectively, of British goods and, eventually, of colonial exports to Britain, timed and structured with specific dates for each phase. What made the association different from earlier, more scattered colonial boycotts was the enforcement architecture built underneath it. Local committees, established in towns and counties across every participating colony, tasked with monitoring compliance, publishing the names of merchants who violated the boycott, and applying social and economic pressure to enforce an agreement that had no formal legal authority behind it, beyond the colony's own collective will to make it work.
This was, in practical terms, 13 colonies building a shared system of self-policing compliance for the first time in their history. Ordinary committees, in ordinary towns, coordinating with committees in colonies most of their members had never visited, toward a single agreed objective. Parliament had passed a law specifically designed to prevent colonies from acting in coordinated defiance of British authority. Within a year, colonies were operating a coordinated, colony-wide enforcement network built for exactly that purpose. Britain's response to the Continental Association and the Congress that produced it arrived through the usual channels. Reports from Gage, reports from customs officials, reports from colonial governors watching committees enforce a boycott Parliament had never authorized and could not directly suppress. The specific irony worth sitting with is structural, not stated. Boston Harbor had sat empty in the spring of 1774 because Parliament had closed it, deliberately, to isolate one city's trade and force compliance through economic pressure applied by London. By late 1774, ports and marketplaces across 12 colonies were quieting for a different reason entirely. Not because Parliament had closed them, but because colonists had voluntarily closed their own trade with Britain, choosing to inflict the same kind of pressure on London that London had tried to inflict on Massachusetts. The mechanism Parliament had used against one city, colonists were now using, collectively, against the empire that had used it first. Lord North's government faced a version of the same miscalculation, compounded by a year of accumulated evidence. The strategy of isolation had produced coordination. The punishment aimed at one colony had produced a shared network of local committees spanning 13. And the specific tool of economic pressure Parliament had wielded against Boston was now being wielded, at continental scale, against British merchants and manufacturers who had never had any direct role in the Tea Party or in writing the acts that followed it. The Quebec Act, passed by Parliament around the same period, and often folded by angry colonists into the same basket of grievances as the coercive acts, deserves a more careful distinction than colonial anger gave it. It addressed different territory and different issues entirely, expanding Quebec's boundaries and extending legal toleration to Catholic residents there, a piece of governance with no direct punitive intent toward the other colonies. Its inclusion in the colonial narrative of British overreach owed more to unfortunate timing than to any shared strategic purpose with the acts aimed at Massachusetts, and colonial anger toward it reflected genuine anti-Catholic sentiment and territorial anxiety more than a coherent connection to the punishment of Boston. That distinction did not slow the momentum building elsewhere. The machinery Parliament had triggered while trying to prevent coordinated colonial resistance was, by the end of 1774, the exact machinery that would organize it. Carpenter's Hall still stands today in Philadelphia's Old City, a modest brick building that draws a fraction of the visitors that gather at Independence Hall, a short walk away. It functioned in 1774 as the meeting place of the Carpenters' Company, a guild that rented its second floor to the delegates who needed somewhere to convene. Visitors can walk through it now and see a room considerably smaller and plainer than the scale of what was decided inside it. Boston Harbor no longer sits empty. It has not sat empty in the specific way the Port Act made it empty for 2.5 centuries. The particular silence of 1774, ships idle, an entire city's commerce halted by legislative decision, exists now only in the historical record. In the correspondence Gage sent back to London describing a situation that would not resolve the way his orders assumed it should. What the coercive acts demonstrate is not that Parliament miscalculated in some minor, correctable way. It demonstrates something more specific about how punishment aimed at isolating a single target can misjudge the underlying structure it is operating on. Parliament assumed 13 colonies with a century and a half of divergent interests, competing economies, and no history of political cooperation would behave as 13 separate, self-interested actors when only one of them was punished. They shared a legal architecture Parliament had just proven could be revoked by a single act of legislation. That shared vulnerability produced for the first time in colonial history something closer to a shared identity. A law written to isolate one city and silence 12 others instead built the network, the boycott, and the Congress that would, within less than a year, be organizing a continental resistance no single colony could have assembled on its own. Drop a comment. Can you think of a modern example of a punishment that backfired by uniting exactly the people it was meant to divide? I read every comment and I'm always surprised by the answers.